Welcome back, everyone, and today we're going to talk about early river civilizations, and specifically we're going to look about the early civilization of Egypt. So Egypt is a really interesting civilization, and I'm really excited to talk about this one with you. So first off, again, I want to remind you of some important aspects of this class. As we're going through, you need to be taking notes. You need to take notes about any important vocabulary, which will be on the side here, as well as any questions or ideas that you think are relevant. Think about our essential question: what is the factors that create the rise and fall of civilizations? As well as our outline, we will talk about Egypt. Specifically, we'll talk about the two kingdoms of Egypt, as well as the science, art, and writing of the time. As we go through, if you see the star, it means that we're going over standards or star practices. If you see the brain, it means we're talking about prior knowledge. If you see the bell, it means this is testable material. Okay, let's get started. So Egypt is an amazing civilization. It's one of the oldest civilizations out there, as long as one of the longest running. So as we talk about all these different civilizations, we're going to find a recurring theme back to Egypt. It's going to be there, it's going to stay there, and it's going to encompass all of this ancient history that we'll discuss over the next couple of months. So there was three distinct kingdoms of Egypt at this time, and we're going to talk about the first two today. In the location of Egypt took place primarily around the Nile. So the Nile is going to be the lifeblood of Egypt, and we'll go into that in a minute. But the important thing to remember is the delta. That's the opening or the mouth of the river of the Nile, and it actually creates a really interesting dynamic. And most times we would call this the north and this the south. But in ancient Egypt, it was actually the opposite. The north was down here because it was the furthest away from the delta, while the south was up here because it was closest to the delta. The river flowed in this direction. So the north was where the river flowed from, to this in the south was where the river flowed to. It's really important to remember that, as this is going to play an important factor of how we talk about Egypt and the way people lived. So just keep that in mind. The north is actually down here, and the south is up here, closest to the delta. So the early Egyptians were desert people. They were from these outer desert areas, and they kind of gravitated towards that river, much like our other civilizations. The river was a great natural defense. It had all of this desert areas nearby, so it was hard for other civilizations to get in, as well as the people in this area had very little conflict, which allowed for civilizations to flourish without a lot of fighting and war. So like I said, the Nile is a gift to Egypt. It is the foundation of what Egypt is. Without the Nile, early Egyptian culture could not have been developed. It was developed around the Nile, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the religious practices of the Egyptians. But the best thing to know is that the Nile, unlike the Indus River and unlike the China River, is a very controlled, predictable flooding. It has what's called seasonal flooding. This is a predictable and controlled period of environmental water expansion, where the river grew outwards in order to encompass land, and then it would recede afterwards to showcase this very fertile land along the edges. The water was used both for travel as well for agriculture. They developed one of the earliest irrigation systems that we have, and developed it so well that it's still used in many parts of Egypt today. The Greek historian Herodotus said this about Egypt: gathering fruit from earth was less labor than any other man. When the river has some up of itself, and after water has left them again, that means when the water had expanded, flooded, and then receded, then each man sows his own field, and he waits for the harvest. So it's basically believed that Egypt had it made. They had a beautiful, thriving environment with very little stress, very little unpredictability, making it perfect for the rise of civilization. So the religion of early Egypt revolved around polytheism. So that was the idea of many gods. Specifically, they had the idea of many gods based on a seasonal pattern, which makes sense. If their river, which is their life force, right, their main idea of what life is revolves around this river, was seasonal, then of course their gods would be too. So for example, Ra, which was the god of the sun, and the head god had a recurring life. So each morning he would start at the edge of the world and drive across it to the other edge, and he would be born every morning and die every night, over and over, the seasonal pattern. As well as Orsiceros, I'm saying that wrong, I apologize, was the god of death and plants. He was kind of the opposite. So every night he would be born and every morning he would die. And as well as the Nile itself was considered a part of this world. So for example, in early Egypt, if we go back to our map, early Egypt, most people lived on this side of the Nile. They lived on the western, I'm sorry, I apologize. They lived on the eastern side of the Nile where the sun rose because Ra was their god. But on the west side of the Nile was the afterlife, death. So they believed the other side of the Nile represented where the afterlife was, where people went after they died. And so the big thing for them with the afterlife was believe the soul goes to the afterlife. So after a person dies, their very soul comes back exactly as they are and goes to the afterlife. That's one of the reasons they mummified bodies. It was the idea was that if they mummified and kept it purified, then that body would be able to be used by the soul. So then you have early pyramids. These early pyramids are actually tombs. So tombs were for pharaohs or the kings of the civilization, and we'll talk more about that. But so everything revolved around this afterlife. So people lived in order to die. Living at the time was more about doing the things you need to do until it was time for you to die. Society also revolved around these concepts, specifically daily life. So there's, just like many other civilizations of this time, you have a hierarchy. The head of the hierarchy is the pharaoh or the king, who is an incarnation of God, specifically the incarnation of the god Horus, which was one of the high gods of the seasonal benevolence, the person who was in charge of like the recurring patterning. It makes sense, right? They're all about that pattern, that kind of reoccurring cycle. So it makes sense that the pharaoh, the head of society, was also about that reoccurring pattern. Below the pharaoh is the priests and officials, who are often part of the royal family, as well as scholars who would write as scribes, tax collectors, as well as people who would take notes in other important chronologically things of the time. And then lastly, in the middle class, you have artisans and merchants who kind of took care of the flow of trade, as well as the development of these beautiful sculptures and art pieces. And for the most part, these higher and middle people lived luxurious lives. They did things like have parties, go to festivals, laze around all day, played board games, float on the river, go swimming. They were all about having just kind of a relaxed time, enjoying their life, while the farthest and the majority of the people, so the higher middles, maybe 10% of the population, the majority, 90% of the population were peasants who were used as labor forces. You see here, you'll see that they are doing things like collecting grain, creating sculptures, as well as doing trade. And so these people below would be the commoners who would do dirty work, who would take care of the land, while these upper people would have fun and kind of just laze around. Two big things also in the society is food and culture. So at the time, people ate mostly bread, onions, fish, vegetables, and beer. So beer is really interesting in early Egypt because it isn't like we think of it today. It isn't a liquid. It isn't a drink. It was actually a fermented paste. So it was grain that was fermented in a jar, and then you would take it and you would spread it on top of bread or other foods in order to kind of get that buzzy feeling. So these are the earliest concepts we have of beer, which is some kind of fermented paste made out of barley and wheat, but it isn't what we think of today. In addition, almost everyone wore these kind of light white covers. All of it was white because they didn't use dye at the time. Dye wouldn't stick very well, and it would often look unpleasant. And so they would have this very nice, beautiful white garment, and then they would have colorful beadings and jewelry that would represent kind of that color and that life. So at this time, you would have two ancient kingdoms. So in ancient Egypt, from about 7,000 BCE to about 1500 BCE, we would have some of our earliest, I believe that's backwards, it should be 1500 to 700 BCE. We have some of our earliest kingdoms, but they were not united. So you had an upper kingdom, which is actually down here, and a lower kingdom, which is up here. However, we had a man named Namar who actually united the kingdoms, and we know this by this palette. This is a very famous palette that was really important to kind of the culture. So if you look, so in the lower portion of Egypt, they would have these red crowns that looked like this, and then the upper part of Egypt, they had white crowns, which if I can find a look, it kind of looks like, I can find it. It looks like this part right here. So on one side, you see him only wearing the red one, and then the other side, he's wearing both, and he's commanding a large army. So that's how we know that he was the one who united these two people, creating one kingdom. And this would be the start of our three main kingdoms, specifically the start of the Old Kingdom. And as we go through, we'll talk about the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom, which were the three main periods of Egyptian rule in what is modern day Egypt along the Nile. And they're separated by these periods of disorder. So we'll talk about how each of these kingdoms would fall to some issue, and there'd be 100 to 500 years of disorder, and then a new king or ruler will rise, and we'll have a new period of prosperity for Egypt. The first kingdom we're going to talk about is the Old Kingdom. It started around about 2600 BCE and lasted about a little under 500 years. So this is the establishment of our first pharaohs. This was both a religious and governmental leader of ancient Egypt. So it's really important to recognize that the word pharaoh wasn't actually the name for the king. Pharaoh means great house. It was actually considered to be too sacred to say the ruler of Egypt's name, so they just called him pharaoh. And it became the kind of the name of all the leaders. When instead of kings, they were pharaohs. In this early civilization, Old Kingdom is where we have the development of our pyramids. The majority of what we consider to be Egyptian periods were developed in the Old Kingdom. It was actually not developed later on. It was mostly in the early years of the Old Kingdom. The process of building was enormous. It could take years for them to build it, as well as thousands and thousands of manpower and hours. So why did they spend all this time building it? Well, these pyramids represented tombs. Remember, they lived for the afterlife. The afterlife was important. This life, it didn't matter too much. The afterlife is where everything big happened. And so when their pharaoh is so sacred, when their leader is so sacred to them that they want to build this giant monument so that he can rest in kind of luxury, that's exactly what they did. And so they would spend years and years building the pyramids, building these giant monstrosities that would last forever. And they represented both power and perfection. The four sides, the triangles, the fact that it had a square base, all represented what they considered to be the utter perfection of architecture. It was very important to them that it looked beautiful all the way around. And actually, if you go inside one, what's inside is you have these columns and these rows of beautiful paintings and sculptures just going all the way down with amazing things. And these pharaohs would be buried with servants and with maids and their dogs and their pets and their wives and everything they could possibly need in order to have a pleasant and luxurious afterlife. So next we're going to talk about the Middle Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom kind of fell towards, well, we know that Old Kingdom fell because over time these giant pyramids actually began to get smaller, and so that we know people are less caring about the pharaoh, about the way of life. And what happens is these chieftains who are ruling small tribes nearby kind of attacked, and there was like a falling out, and people began to form small tribes versus being the big kingdom. These tribes would last until about 2100 BCE, and then you would have King Amenemhet the first, who conquered all the tribes and kind of reunited Egypt. And so this new king was only partially divine. So while the first pharaoh, for early pharaohs, were these divine gods, these new kings, these new pharaohs were mostly human, maybe divinely appointed, but human and had human fallacies. This new king would develop things like literature, science, and art, which would spread throughout the area, as well as the development of more writings and we'll talk about hieroglyphs later on that kind of developed during this time, as well as the development of government. You would have the position of vizier that would be introduced. This was the highest government official who served a pharaoh or supreme ruler of ancient Egypt. And basically the vizier's job was kind of to both advise and rule instead of the pharaoh. They also developed new forms of trade. So the old kingdom of Egypt kind of remained by itself. It didn't really have a lot of trade, while the middle kingdom definitely kind of started spreading out and talking with Assyria and Persia, which we'll talk about in our next video. So during this time, like I said, we have the development of science, art, and writing. So at this time, science and math were the two biggest things that were developed. So we have you have the introduction of fractions. They figured out the solar calendar, so they developed a 12-month calendar with 365 and a half days, with 5 days put to the side for festivals. They have smelting, which is the melting of metals to process from refined goods, as well as blowing glass. Embalming, which would be how we have our first mummies, as well as herbalism, which would develop into medicine later on. At this time, you also have art and writing, so the introduction of hieroglyphs, which would, we can see right here, which would develop one of our earliest writing systems to form of pictograms, much like cuneiform, and that would develop into other forms of writing as well, which would allow for ease of communication and trade. They believed that the main form of art was actually agriculture, so they would do two main things. So first off, they would have these huge monuments alongside these beautifully, delicately made, tiny stone and precious metal items. On top of that, you begin to see the classic Egyptian, wall painting with the persons to the side, and that actually has a lot of religious meaning. So the reason they're to the side is because if they believe that if the person's face was forward, they could actually steal your soul. So they didn't want any pictures to have faces forward, because they could steal your soul and become you. So instead they faced them to the side to kind of stop that from happening. At the same time, with the development of literature, we have the introduction of papyrus, which is an ancient form of paper using a papyrus leaf that was just dried, and they would write on it. So for a long time, hieroglyphs were actually lost to the world. We had no idea how to decipher them, much like early Indus Valley. However, what happened is we have this thing called the Rosetta Stone. This was this huge, giant stone tab that kind of had three ancient writings on it. So at the bottom, you had Greek. In the middle, you had what's called Demotic, which was a type of hieroglyph. It was kind of what developed after hieroglyphs that kind of told you, it was more similar to cuneiform or Greek, but it kind of still had that meaning of a hieroglyph. And then on top, you had hieroglyphs. So most likely they believed that this was a writing done by one of the pharaohs to kind of declare something across the nation. And much like in a lot of European countries where they would have three types of languages on a tab, on a sign, just so most people could read it, they would do the same thing with these giant slabs. So the Rosetta Stone was this giant declaration that they found further north, and on it they have these three languages, and because it was the same message three times and we knew Greek, we were able to then go back and decipher hieroglyphs, and we unlocked the language, which is really important that we unlock the language, because when we unlock an ancient language, we immediately know so much more about that civilization, because we have access to their records, to their writings, to what they believed. Everything from basic journals to tax collections are written in this language, and by knowing it, we have a much deeper understanding of these early civilizations. So In today's class, we talked about kind of going further into the Bronze Age. We talked about Neber, who united Egypt by combining the upper and lower Egyptian, as well as the development of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, where we see the development of pyramids. We have a couple of years in between where there was a lot of infighting and tribal nations, and then the development of the Middle Kingdom, which is more along the lines of these kind of beautiful architectural sculptures with hieroglyphs built into it. Some important factors to remember is that the Nile River, like all the other kingdoms, early river civilizations, had rivers. It was a river, it was plentiful, it was a gift, it was very important to the very life and structure of early Egypt. There were two main kingdoms that were united to develop the Old Kingdom, which was the development of pyramids. And again, we have more talk about that divine rule. It's so important to our culture and how these early civilizations picked rulers. Divine rule, godly appointment, very important. Then we have the introduction of the Middle Kingdom. This was a little bit different. The Middle Kingdom didn't have a divine rule. It had divine appointment, which is a little bit different. We have science, art, and writing that was development. And then the Rosetta Stone, which unlocked a whole language for us to decipher and learn more about. Like in our previous video, we're going to talk about the same question along the lines of civilizations, which means city in Latin. So what were the factors that created the rise and fall of civilizations? Think back to Egypt and what we just learned and see if that changes any of your thoughts. Okay, that is it for today. If you need any help from me, feel free to send me an email, phone call, or come to office hours on Thursday at 12:45 p.m. And make sure to go take your post-lecture assessment. Get that done as soon as possible. And I will see you all in live lectures. Have a great day, everyone.